Okay, so this is our final topic for the course. Topic 10, where we're talking about computer abuse detection and investigation. And really, the key concept that we really talk about here is this idea of an incident response. What do you do about when something happens? What do you do? All right. Readings, there's a NIST document, special publication 861. I think we've talked about this in some other areas as well. But there's all so there's that's one guide right here. There's also 886, 800 on 883, which focus on what we call forensics, incident response, and in addition, the idea of a malware incident prevention handling for desktops and laptops. Right. So just a couple terms we want to, when we're talking about this idea of an incident response or an IR. So we have, I guess from the highest level, we have what we call an event. So an event is defined as any observable occurrence in a system or network. Remember, it could be anything that goes on. In a computer system at any given point in time, there can be millions of events that are occurring. Large shared networks, and packet a packet going through a router being processed is an event. So obviously, most events occur. They're scheduled. They're designed to do something. They execute. They're completed. An adverse event is one which the outcome of it is not a normal outcome, but it has a negative consequence. So there's all sorts of bad things that can happen. Usually things like system crashes and unauthorized use of system privileges, access to information. That's all we put into the category of an adverse event. A computer security incident is basically an event that is violation of policies, acceptable use policies, standard security. So it's a type of event. It's a computer security incident. Is a type of adverse event. All right. So examples is computer security incidents. Attacker, does a denial of service attack by sending a large numbers of connection requests to web server, cause a crash, or in the case of a phishing attack, somebody receiving an email and gets tricked into clicking on a link which actually downloads malware onto the machine. Attacker obtains sensitive information by whatever means and threatens public release, or sharing sensitive information. So any number of events. There's just some different examples of this. When these types of things occur, what happens is you need to have what we call an incident response plan. Right? So remember, we talked before about continuity planning, and we talked about business continuity planning, which really deals with what if what if the entire operation, an event happens that impacts the entire operation. Incident response is basically a very focused type of response. So it's kind of, you think of it as a smaller disaster recovery. Right? There's not everything, but it's definitely an event that has to be, that, has adverse effect and needs to be dealt with. All right. So there's a whole bunch of different circumstances that kind of come into play. Frequently, the idea is when an attack happens, it'll compromise personal and sensitive information, and a response is required. The idea is, of incident response planning is, it helps to minimize the loss and disruption of services caused by these types of incidents. Depending upon where you're at, the type of business you're in, federal agencies obviously fall under, they have specific guidelines and policies on the federal side, which, dictate what needs to be covered in terms of incident response. But it's also not necessarily limited to any organization needs to create an incident response program around, or policy around this. So some of the So the starting point is the kind of a creation of your starting point is the creation of an incident response policy. So statement of management, the scope, definitions of the incidents, the organizational structures responsible for dealing with this stuff, prioritization of events. So these are all different elements that kind of fall, it needs to be captured in a policy. A plan, once you develop a policy, the next thing would be to actually turn that policy and create a plan, use that and create a plan. So the plan would be derived from the policy and involve specific, um, specific components that So in terms of communication techniques and metrics and roadmap for on an ongoing basis, developing, testing, and building an overall capability around this stuff. So one of the key areas that we focus on with incident response is it's not necessarily a totally internally focused thing. It actually has ties into a number of different stakeholders like customers and media and software. In the event of compromised software systems, um, the organization that wrote it, law enforcement in case of things that have criminal activities, um, internet service providers. So any numbers. So there's a whole. The scope of this stuff is, obviously a strong focus on internal, but also engagement with outside parties as needed. There was actually organizations, within the federal government, CERT, so the Computer Emergency Readiness Team, U.S. If you hear that term, U.S. CERT, is really an agency, provides that looks at this stuff and provides recommendation, guidance, best practices for organizations that dealing with this stuff. So it will do it on an ongoing basis of evaluation of attacks, and different trends and different approaches and things like that, which can be used and incorporated into an organization's specific plans. In addition, there's also a set of industry-specific programs depending upon the type of industry. So financial services or utilities or chemical manufacturing or different organizations can all have what we call an ISAC, an Information Sharing and Analysis Center, that deals with security from the perspective of that organization, of that kind of that verticals, the things that impact that vertical the most. Some of the stuff we talked about here, some of the different types of communication with outside parties. You're talking about different kinds of things, depending upon, what are the circumstances of the IR, what is the exact, what is the incident, what is the response, and then kind of what, depending upon the specifics of that, what other parties need to be drawn into the conversation. A couple of different ways these things get implemented. You can have a central model, you can have a decentralized model, distributed model, or you can have coordination. So it's kind of a mix between centralized and decentralized. And each one, team models is all function of that particular organization's, what does it see it's important. Some of the services, are focused around this stuff. So intrusion detection, how do you know you've been impacted? This actually becomes a thing. It becomes more and more difficult as time goes on, as malware gets smarter and smarter and smarter. As we talked around these advanced persistent threat models for malware, trying to understand that you are under attack, detecting it can be very challenging. And then the advisory distributions, education and awareness, information sharing. This is a collective activity, dealing with both private industry and government agencies working together to try to identify and establish programs around how to identify an incident and how to establish a effective response. Basically, some guidelines here. The recommendations: form a formal incident response. Develop procedures, establish communications with different relative parties, different organizations. what are the different factors? How do we know? What do you do? How do you declare an incident? How do you track an incident? And so all of these different things are all part parts and parcel. But it's like I said, a lot of if you can think of an incident response as kind of a mini disaster recovery plan. Disaster recovery plan spans the entire organization, all the processes and all the technology. IR tends to be a little bit more focused. So the life cycle, the idea of a preparation. We start off with this idea of preparation, detection and analysis, which goes on an ongoing basis. When something's detected, whenever that occurs, this idea of an, eradication recovery and then a post incident recovery, which feeds back into the preparation. So this becomes an ongoing, preparation, detection just as an ongoing um, activity, ongoing monitoring, and then as things occur, this idea of eradication, containment, eradication, and recovery, restabilization of the organization. A couple things that can be done. So this idea of preventing incidents, idea of first and foremost, risk assessments. What is the risk profile? What are the things we have to look at? What is for every piece of infrastructure we have out there? What is the security profile, the risk profile associated with that? From the both the host, the computer systems, and the network. They have their own sets of best practices and hardening, the security hardening approaches. So all systems need to be brought up to that all of that needs to be defined. All of the systems need to be brought up to speed and maintained on an ongoing basis. Malware prevention, actually malware prevention, detection, all of these things, ongoing, is wired into the ongoing, support on a day-to-day operational basis. And then finally, on the broader sense across the organization, this idea of an awareness and training plan that goes along with incident analysis. So the idea of there are a couple things that need to be involved with this. So the idea is if an incident should occur, there should be a plan to deal with this. All right. So kind of first and foremost, you're early on. First thing you need to do in this plan is number one is profile all your networks and systems. What do you have? What is running? How is it all organized? How is it architected? How are all the pieces coming together? All right. So the idea is you can, for around everything, if you have to understand what the baseline is in order to move forward. In addition to defining, what kind of the physical infrastructure is, understanding what the behavior is. All right. What's activity look like on the network? Is there a pattern associated with it? Is there a pattern associated with um, the technical infrastructure, the systems, and things of that nature? Understands what is normal. And then another piece of this is the idea of a log retention, because really what happens is the log um, system logging, which is as things are occurring, going back in, identifying what all the logs are, because potentially every device on the network and every system will have maintain and sustain some type of log, which really needs to be looked at and evaluated on an ongoing basis. This can be this can be a pretty involved process here, understanding everything and being able to look at it on an ongoing basis. A couple other things we've got here. Perform event correlation. What is a positive? What would be a false positive? Are there things that we can kind of running across the organization? One of the biggest challenges we run into in identifying events is, identifying how things occur kind of in coordination across the entire across different systems and different pieces from network to system, and kind of coordinating all these different kinds of activities. Network security, keep all the clock synchronized, because one of the things you're going to want to do is when things have occurred, you want to go back and be able to recreate. So timelines, reestablishing a timeline, so having accurate timings you can use, and also this idea of of understanding what's going on from a knowledge-based perspective. A lot of information is out there. Information. A lot of you can actually do a lot of. There's a lot of information out there in terms of different security things of that nature. Ongoing collection of capturing packets and understanding what's going on, at different points in time, being able to route traffic through certain in a network across different systems to be able to capture stuff on an ongoing basis is also important. Filtering data, and then so there's a lot that goes into this. So the idea is part of what an organization's plan is going to be to is to define what are we looking at, what are we looking for, how do we respond, and how do we do this on an ongoing basis. Incident documentation. The idea is when an incident occurs, the first thing that really needs to happen is information about what happened, what were the impacts, what were the outcomes, what was done, all needs to be captured. So the idea is we talk about here, document and timestamp every step taken, from the time something was detected to the time it was resolved. And then we also needs to be done is there needs to be a formal review and formal sign off of every event that occurs as we go through. A lot of the stuff, really, the idea is that all this stuff could potentially be used as evidence in a court of law. If should that occur, it doesn't always occur, but should that occur, you want to make sure that what you've captured is potentially usable as evidence in a case. Some of the stuff we see here, there's a couple of things we look at from a prioritization. Number one is what's the functional impact? What's happening? Is there an impact on the applications and on the businesses? From the information impact of the incident really is tied back to what how does the event impact the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the organization's information? That's really the one of our priorities. And then the recoverability. How bad is the problem? Is it something that can be managed and controlled, or is the implications for bigger or broader in nature? Containment strategy. The biggest challenge you run into when something happens is, what is happening, and how many things are affected by it. Some of the approaches that organizations take is, sometimes they have to shut the systems down or disconnect things from the network or disable applications. You can't do that just simply willy-nilly. So the idea of identifying escalation containment strategies around this is something that needs to be kind of worked out and thought through, and escalation plans developed to say, okay, if we detect this, we'll check this and this and this, and based upon circumstances, we can escalate. In one approach could be, in some circumstances, disconnecting a network or bringing a system down and recycling it. These are all different things that have to be, are potential activities, but they have to be thought through. And the appropriate people have to make, the appropriate decision makers need to be engaged. All right, so this is all, what we would define within the containment strategy. Forensic process really kind of happens, that's kind of a after the fact. And as you see, 886 from NIST is, how do you kind of bake in forensic techniques into incident response? So the idea, and this diagram is from the NIST, the idea of going from collection, examination, analysis, reporting, which is really the transformation of what's happening from, media, which is what is occurring, capturing it, turning into data to information, and then depending upon what we have in information, capturing it in such a fashion so it can be captured as evidence. One of the challenges you run into, is the data collection, different types of data, acquire in the acquisition, identification, acquisition, verification types of things, examination, and the analysis, with capturing stuff. So one of the things that needs to be handled is as this information is being captured and basically moved, what needs to be done to preserve it as evidence? Because a lot of times what will happen, especially electronic information, there's certain protocols that have to be established and followed in order for information to be considered protected or admissible as evidence. Just because you've captured something doesn't necessarily mean you can bring it in the court and show it to the judge and expect the judge to accept it. Because what will happen is the first thing that will happen is defense attorney will say, well, how do we know this wasn't created? So being able to show, a trail of, um, the chain of ownership, from, as data was captured all the way through this, on an ongoing basis, and be able to report back on it in such a fashion so to make it, an irrefutable or non-reputable, is very important around within the forensic process. And there's actually a lot of tools and a lot of technologies that have been developed to help facilitate things like this. So the recommendations, the idea would be, forensics is a consistent process. You want to be proactive in collecting useful information. You want to be, you want to follow standard procedures. You want to, be methodical. So you kind of see, you can't just grab stuff willy nilly. So this all has to be thought out, thought through, and managed through, through a process. What are the interesting things? And there's been a lot of discussion around this idea of attacking hosts. If you identify the importance of identifying an attacking host. Somebody says, well, tracking that information is important. One of the problems that you run into with that is that not everybody, wherever this attacking host is coming from, may or may not, have anything to do with the actual source of the attacker. So basically, who's originating the attack. A lot of times we'll use a third party or just a non-engaged party uh, as the mechanism for which to perform the attack, the means through which to perform the attack. So finding, identifying the attacking host. A lot of times it's time consuming. Sometimes it's not worth the effort. The real goal and objective is to minimize the business impact. All right. So you want to minimize the business impact. Um, Ideally, if you can find some information about it, it may come in handy at some point. But it's more around the what is minimize the impact and you know around remediation. Kind of you can capture information to understand kind of what the techniques and different approaches that are being done, but just simply finding the host system where some of the stuff is coming from may or may not be worth the effort involved. Eradication recovery, the idea of eliminate malware, identify the scope of activities, identify all the affected hosts that have to be done. That can be a pretty large effort. All right. The idea of recovery, restoring systems to normal operations, remediate vulnerabilities, prevent similar incidents. So you have to be done. A lot of this stuff has to be done in a phased fashion. So and in a sequence. So there's a process around this stuff. You just don't run around and start replacing or upgrading machines. Sometimes there should be a plan in place to effectively repair the damage that was done, identify the scope of all the affected systems, and put together a plan for basically fixing it. Post incident activities. So things we do. Number one is I did capture all of the information, collect all of this, and kind of assemble it, and then the idea of a evidence retention. Sometimes these things can result in criminal activities or legal activities. So some of the stuff, it may or may not, but you need to be, from a planning perspective, you need to be aware of this stuff and deal with it. And that is everything we need to know about our incident response.